Hello, and welcome to ICANN's post-conference, continuing the conversation on allyship. I'm Amy McLaughlin, Vice President of Programs and Operations at ICANN. Let me begin by explaining why we added this segment to our Women's Leadership Conference offerings. You may have noticed ICANN included the topic of male allyship in the past several years, recognizing that over 70% of all leadership positions occupied by men, women need their support more than ever. Considering the recent actions taken against workplace equality measures and in keeping with our Own Your Value theme, we thought a conversation on how to navigate being an ally today, male or otherwise, has value for us all. Let me introduce today's speakers. Aileen Warren, ICANN President and CEO. Aileen has a long history and connection to ICANN, having been involved in various ways since 1996, before becoming CEO in 2022. Aileen joined ICANN after serving as Associate Vice Chancellor and Executive Director of HR for the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Her 30-plus year career includes serving as a VP of HR at First Data, now Pfizer, and in positions at MFS Communications and First National Bank of Omaha. Next, we have Dr. John Slieter. John has spent over 30 years in the aviation industry with Duncan Aviation, rising from manager of installations to VP of sales in his tenure. At Duncan, John was also a member of the senior leadership team responsible to the Duncan family for overall growth and leadership. John has been a student of leadership for 30 plus years and has taught leadership over the past 15 years, including as a facilitator for ICANN's Defining Leadership for Men. Over to you, Aileen and John.
Thank you, Amy. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining us to spend time on the topic of allyship, with a special emphasis on male allyship. To get us going today, John and I thought it would be helpful to provide a little context for our conversation, starting with a few current DEI-related items, which will help set the tone for the discussion. As many of you know, the legal landscape around DE&I programs is evolving, and the current administration's directives around federal DE&I programs and staff have created much uncertainty. Specifically, there are two executive orders that direct all federal agencies to terminate existing DE&I programs. They require federal contractors to certify they do not maintain illegal DE&I programs with the threat of False Claims Act liability for any misrepresentation. Here in Nebraska, the spotlight on affirmative action took place in 2008 with the Nebraska Civil Rights Initiative, known as Initiative 424. Also, the national spotlight on DE&I has been brewing since July 2023, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that race-based affirmative action in college admissions was unconstitutional. Ironically, 2023 was the first year that women in C-suite positions showed a decline in publicly traded U.S. companies in nearly 2 decades, raising concerns about whether this trend will follow suit at all management levels.
Thanks, Aileen. Yeah, that's important background on the discussion we're going to have today. So this new reality really calls for increased efforts in all forms of allyship in the workplace and within our communities. And while male allyship plays an important role in furthering the cause of gender equality, male leaders may feel a little reluctant these days to act as allies. So today, we really want to address the current status of equality efforts and offer a little encouragement for men and women as we navigate going forward. There's a couple of surveys I want to point out and add to the data that Aileen cited. Seramount ran a couple of surveys, one in 2021. It was called the Pledge to Progress Research, where 95% of corporate executives say they're committed to the work, and 79% of those who feel the focus and attention on DEI was overblown, hinting that maybe executives have been a little ambivalent about DEI before these executive orders hit the U.S. workplace. Recently, a 2024 survey by Seramount called the DEI National Survey, 76% of employees are committed to helping their companies combat racism and injustice, and 78% believe inclusivity is vital to the workplace.
So, John, I think it's important maybe to level set as we get into our conversation today. Let's talk about the definition of DEI because there's been a lot of discussion around that. So that would be my first question for you. And then also, how is the messaging or is the messaging around it changing?
Yeah, good questions. Well, DEI has been around for a long time. I think the term originated 25 years ago, and it's diversity, equity, and inclusion is what the acronym stands for. And it really came out of a recognition, probably as far back as the 70s, that the demographics in our workplaces was changing and becoming way more diverse than we were used to in previous generations. And that diversity included diversity in terms of age, race, gender, and so a lot of organizations said, "Hey, we got to get better at figuring out how to include all kinds of people that may be different than the dominant culture." And so, probably the last 10 to 15 years, this has become a strategic initiative for many organizations. I would say most organizations to really focus on DE and I initiatives. So the message around equality these days may be changing because of the aforementioned national platforms, and a lot of organizations are really looking at the terms and maybe working on getting rid of some terms that might seem a little bit out of place in the current environment. While most organizations, I would say, are staying consistent to their core values, and those values certainly include inclusion.
Yeah. And John, have you seen that across the board, meaning, in private businesses and universities, you name it, because the executive orders don't necessarily apply to everybody, but at the same time, it just seems like everyone is kind of taking heed.
Well, no question that almost all organizations have had some role to play in this, living in the current environment. But I would say probably public universities bore the maybe the largest responsibility because they're so dependent on public funding. They have public boards and members. And are driven somewhat by the political environment, so they had to be a little more sensitive to this. Although public, I would say, um, public organizations that rely on the stock market for funding. That's a always staying kind of on top of social norms and social practices have had to have some adjustments based on shareholder feedback and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's affected all number of organizations, some in different to different degrees.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with you there. One of the other outgrowths of DE&I, and many companies, and some organizations have these are ERGs, the employee resource groups.
Yeah.
Um, Given the changes that are happening right now, should organizations and companies be focused on creating intersectional ERGs as opposed to the traditional gender, race, sexual orientation focused dimensions of diversity? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question too. I think on one hand, there's never been a more important reason to have employee research groups and affinity groups of all kinds because of the environment today. At the same time, we have to be a little more careful. And you cited the Supreme Court ruling in 2023, and really what the Supreme Court said was, for years since maybe the 1960s equal rights movements and things, we've tended to give some preference to some groups that traditionally had been left out of a lot of parts of society. And so we kind of went and bent towards underserved and underrepresented groups. In 2023, the Supreme Court kind of said, well, we can't do that anymore. And any kind of preferential treatment will not be tolerated from a legal perspective. So organizations have to adapt to that. I would say while the research group or resource groups are really important, we just want to stress open enrollment, open membership, inclusion in
Mhm.
naming and inclusion in their mission. In fact, as we talk about male allyship, what better way for men to understand the needs of women leaders, for example, but to join a resource group and listen to the discussions and learn about the challenges and things like that. So I would
Yeah,
say, it's still important. We just need to be careful about the landscape.
yeah, I would totally agree with you there because I've worked for a variety of companies in Omaha. And I think that the ones that have been the ERGs that have been most successful are been the ones that have done just that in terms of the open membership, focusing on shared interest and, avoiding the preferential treatment discussion, or the appearance of that. And
Yeah.
so I totally agree with you there in terms of the importance of them and how to make them more inclusive to make them successful and to keep them open to everybody.
Yeah.
So with that, in your opinion, how can allyship actions and programs be used, maybe in lieu of DEI programs, or should they be?
Yeah. Well, and my opinions typically are formed by what I read in the journals. A couple of pieces of research recently from MIT and the Technical University of Munich suggest that allyship programs will be on the rise. There's really a growing
Mhm.
need for allyship in all kinds of forms. And so it's important that these groups get together to figure out how do marginalized groups navigate how do we get the dominant groups to work with the marginalized groups to share information, share challenges, and that's just an important way of thriving in this environment.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and you bring up a good point in terms of thriving in the current environment and given everything that's happening. Can you offer your thoughts around how leaders can offer support to their teams? Because I'm sure we have some people that are in leadership roles that are joining us on the call today,
Yeah.
and how they can support their employees given some of this uncertainty.
Yeah, well, I think I always start with reassessing our own personal values. And as leaders, of course, we're called upon to reflect the values of our organizations. And so I think kind of resetting and reaffirming our value set. Um, and that includes our attitude towards differences in society and in the workplaces. I think adapting DEI programs to really get rid of some language that are a little thorny, but really to emphasize inclusivity because it's still workplaces thrive with diverse workforces. The research is deep on that topic. And yet, at the same time, it takes a real spirit of inclusion to bring a diverse group of people together around common causes. I also think psychological safety is a key issue, is just really staying
Mm,
focused on that. And when we say inclusion, we really have to foster that through our cultures and invite people to the table very purposely. I think communicating clearly and consistently is really important. And then, of course, seeking legal advice on how to navigate language, for example, and titles and our public facing information and media.
yeah, I think those are all really good items to consider, as a leader when you're leading a team. And then individuals themselves. So many times the leaders are giving to their teams. What about how do leaders take care of themselves right now, in this environment? Thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. There's a fair amount of maybe overblown fear about what's going on today. Now, of course,
Mm,
maybe if you're in a minority group, maybe a historically underserved group of people, I think that's natural and maybe in some cases
hmm
well-founded. At the same time, we've got to work through fear and find a way to stay positive and really reconnecting to our own mission, as I said earlier, our own values, our own why. Why are we in this organization? What is our role to play here? And then focusing on ways to stay relevant, to look at what's possible, maybe stepping up our leadership, whether you're in
Mm,
a leadership role formally or not. We all are leaders and members of an organization. And then, boy, hanging on to our empathy in today's world with such divisive politics and things all around us, just being a little more calm and a little more empathetic about what's going on. There's reasons that people disagree, and maybe allowing for that to be aired and not letting it impact us personally in negative ways. So staying informed, maybe not fixating on all the politics of it, but staying engaged in
mhm.
the social movements of the day, I think is important.
Yeah, and I really like what you said in terms of, leaders stepping up. It's kind of leaning into all of the things that you've learned as a leader right now. Because again, like you said, there's so much going on, and now is the time more than ever, right? For
Uh,
leaders to step up, to lean in, to be there for them, their employees, to be there for themselves, in order to navigate everything that's happening,
yeah, you're
for
so
sure.
right, Eileen. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, how can individuals ensure um, when they're practicing allyship or they're going down the path of allyship that it's safe?
Hmm.
Because I think that's the other thing, right? That sometimes people don't know, you know, even speaking up, right? When they
Yeah.
see something that's happening and they want to advocate on behalf of someone, anything that you can offer there in terms of it being, keeping it safe and keeping it, comfortable. And maybe it won't be comfortable. I don't know.
Yeah, well, again, I hate to be a broken record, but you got to go back to your own core values, and for most of us in leadership roles, we have values around empathy and thinking about the world through other people's eyes. So I think one, taking care of ourselves, which is
Yep.
is really important. Having a way to stay energized, a way to recover, and then just not feeling like you have to be the expert at everything. And
Hmm.
my favorite quote is an Einstein quote that said, "The smartest thing I ever said was the question that I asked." And so,
Mm,
being an ally, for one, as a male ally, I don't pretend to know what women leaders need. I, I need to
mm.
always be asking and inquiring and wondering, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I was curious about, John, because you are a doctor now, and congratulations on that. I know
Thank you.
some of the work that you did revolved around the whole discussion of allyship and male allyship. Any things from your studies that you think would be important to share with our audience today?
Well, I think a lot of the data said that taking care of yourself is still important. As you look at the world out there, I did a lot of work with caregivers, for example, in the medical field, and the one thing we've learned over the years is number one, taking care of yourself. To be a good caregiver, to be a helper, to be an ally of any kind, really comes from a position of strength. So taking care of that, finding your own way of staying resilient, your own method of resiliency, bouncing back after setbacks. That's
Hmm.
all borne out in the literature, and it says, if you're going to help others, first take care of yourselves. And I always remember when you get on the airplane and they drop the oxygen down. What do they say?
Right.
Take care of yourself first. You can't help others if you don't get your mask on first. And that's just a great analogy for leaders, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Amy, those are the questions that I had, and I know we wanted to make this more of a discussion for some folks that are joining us, in that there were some questions that were sent in ahead of time. So if you don't mind rejoining us, and maybe we can hit a couple of those questions as a part of our discussion.
Sure, sure thing, Allyne. As she said, now is the question and answer portion of our time together. And at the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A or a question and answer button. Feel free to provide any questions you might have, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. I'll start with questions that were sent in advance. So, how can I be a good ally? What are some of the steps to becoming a good ally?
Well, I'll jump in, John, and then I'll let
Yeah.
you give your thoughts as well. I think one of the most important things is not being afraid to be an ally. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to be able to step in when you see things that are inappropriate or things that are
Mhm.
making someone else feel uncomfortable or making yourself feel uncomfortable. And I think it's so important to reach down and have the courage um, to point it out. I think for me, that has been when I think of my history and in my life in the workplace or just in my community, being willing to be that voice, when I see something that's not right or doesn't feel right, being willing to challenge that.
Yeah, right on. I
Okay.
think that's perfect, Aileen. I would add to that, depending on your role in the organization, you might take a global perspective. We heard from several CEOs at the Women's Leadership Conference about looking out at the landscape and saying, we have certain groups that are underserved in leadership roles in our organization, and we just want to be intentional about that. And so, if you're at that level, you can do that. If you're a line supervisor in charge of a small group, just watching that all members have access to activities, to the decision-making process, and maybe being real intentional about reaching out, especially to historically underserved groups. But just asking questions, just being open
Mhm.
for input, and being there for other people. That takes a
Yeah,
certain level of intentionality.
Great.
John, I love that. Sometimes just being that voice, right?
Yeah.
Just being that voice.
Right, right. How can I support my colleagues without overstepping?
Mm.
Ooh, that's a good one. John, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I share a story in Defining Leaders um, series, and I'll make this brief. Uh, I was in charge of sales for a lot of years, and I was on a sales call with one of my female salespeople, and the client, a really important client that we needed to close, you know, shared an off-color joke, if you will, and it made us all uncomfortable. And at the time, I did nothing. I wanted to step in, but I didn't. Later on the plane ride home, I asked the question, gee, I feel bad. Should I have said something? Was that offensive to you? And she just was beautiful in her answer and said, you know what? I don't need to be rescued. And when we're in that those kind of things happen all the time. We're in a kind of a male-dominated industry. But thank you for asking. And I got credit for asking the question. Um, but acting like we have to jump into other people's rescue is not necessarily the right impulse. And again, I go back to the questions. Okay, what could I have done? And I got some good advice when I did that.
Yeah, and I was
Okay.
going to say, John, I love it because sometimes, I'm an HR professional. I mean, that I worked probably in HR for 35 plus years, and that was kind of part of my role as an HR professional, right? In terms of when things were happening in the company, or if I was in meetings and I saw people getting left out, or I saw something that, I didn't feel comfortable with. Being willing to say something, and so many times I would go back and have conversations with those individuals. You know what I'm saying? In terms of just
Yeah.
to check in, and saying,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Sometimes you're going to make a mistake. I think that's the other thing that, to your point that, the woman saying she didn't need to be rescued. Sometimes people don't, sometimes they do. But I
Yeah.
think being able to have that discussion is really important. And that's one of the things I always tried to do when I was in that role of an ally, somehow circling back to that individual and having some rich discussion about it was very important.
That's perfect. Well
Right,
said.
right. At ICAN, we talk a lot about the importance of listening. When
Hmm.
it comes to allyship, is listening enough?
Hmm.
I think listening is paramount in terms of understanding what someone may be going through on either side, right? I mean, sometimes people just don't know for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think listening on all sides when it comes to allyship is really important in terms of trying to get to the root of what's happening and what is going on. So I don't know if it's the end all be all, but I think listening is very important as a part of allyship.
I couldn't agree more, Allyne. I think everything starts with listening. Uh, all positive understanding of each other starts with listening. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of active empathic listening, and those skills include some action. So once you hear something, maybe it's feeding it back and creating a discussion, just like we're having here. If all we did was listen, well, it wouldn't be much of a discussion, would it? So while listening is absolutely critical, having discussion about things is kind of the next step before you decide on any kind of action steps. So listening, discussion, gaining agreement are the important steps.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would just add too that sometimes we can model good listening,
Mm,
right? In terms of how to how to be a good listener.
Oh,
You know, there
yeah,
are skills in terms of how you do that. Sometimes you just have to keep your mouth shut and just let people go on about what's
right.
happening
hmm
in their lives right now. And I think sometimes we get so busy, right? With everything that we have going on that we don't take the time to really fully listen and give people an opportunity to talk about what's happening with them. So taking the
Yeah.
Right.
time is really important too.
Yeah.
Great, great input. We have a live question. Thank you for the live question. And it asks, what is the best way to ask for male allyship?
Mm.
How do you ask for that?
Isn't
John, I'm
it?
gonna let you go first
Well, isn't it
as the
just
male on the
w-
panel.
kind of what we're doing here? First of all, having the discussion, and it isn't always just blurt out, "Hey, I need help here, dummy." I think having the conversations and helping the guys understand the need, I think, is important. As we did at the leadership conference, and we had some roundtable discussions. A lot of it is to be a good male ally. I need to understand your world and your needs a little bit better. And rather than just, my wife taught me that over the years. Sometimes I just need to listen to better understand before I jump in and offer help that might be a little misguided.
Yeah, and Amy, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, as ICAN, the organization, we've tried to spotlight more and more around male allyship, in terms of the importance of that. And I think some of it is just having some of those discussions with male leaders in your organization as
Yeah.
well, right? In terms of how important allyship is, not only from a male perspective, but just from everyone's perspective. I mean, allyship
Mhm.
applies to everybody. And, right now we just feel the male allyship piece is so very important given all of the things that are happening today. And so that's why we just wanted to spend a little extra time just pointing that the male allyship piece out today. And I have found most males are open to that conversation.
I
Great,
agree.
great.
Yeah.
Very important. Right. Here's an interesting question. How do women promote and encourage female allyship?
Mm. Okay, Eileen, this is your turn.
Right. Well, I would just say again, it's all about relationships. It's all about understanding each other. It's all about understanding environments and what's happening in the environment. And when you think of, there's mentorship and there's allyship, right? And I know we're talking about allyship today in terms of how do you step up and help someone else? How do you just be there for someone, but because maybe they can't be there for themselves for whatever reason, that they're uncomfortable or they're unsure. So for women, I think it's just a matter of being willing to, assess the environment and to be able to just have that frank conversation around it. That allyship again is important, whether you're male or female, and hopefully, through some of the things that we do at ICANN and some of the things that we talk about at the conference, that the whole topic of allyship, people that's kind of resonating with people. And so whether you're a man or a woman, that people will see the importance of that and the willingness to step forward. And I brought up mentorship because that's important as well. I think we as women could do a lot and continue to do a lot to support each other in that respect as well. So many times just having someone in your corner to talk to, who you can relate to,
Mhm.
is very important as well. And again, mentors can be either sex, right?
Mhm.
But the question was about women in terms of allyship, and I just wanted to mention that as well.
I also think it's important that we think through our careers and think back and reflect once in a while on those that were in critical positions to help you along the way. And
Hmm.
just kind of
Hmm.
playing that forward and saying, well, am I doing that for others? And kind of questioning ourselves. Again, it takes intention to be an ally. And so always be watching out for those times where you could step in and maybe give somebody a hand. And it might be in small little ways. It might be giving a tip
Hmm.
on how their appearance or the clothing or how people are showing up and giving feedback in real, honest, and genuine kinds of ways.
And sometimes it could be just asking. I've gone into
Mm.
meetings before and say, I'm going to need your help in this meeting. You know what I'm saying? I've already
Yeah,
kind of set the tone
yeah.
for if I'm going to need some extra support, for example, in a meeting from maybe a female or a male. Right? Sometimes you just have that conversation beforehand. So I think that's important as well.
Right.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Aileen, the classic is you're sitting in a meeting and you see somebody sitting on their hands and not sharing and being able to reach out
Hmm.
and say, "Hey, Aileen, I know you've got a lot of knowledge in this topic and I haven't
Yes.
heard from you." And encouraging others to speak it can be powerful.
Great. Great. Thank you. The next question is on biases. How do I address my own biases?
Hmm.
Well, first of all, is knowing that everyone has them, right? I mean, I don't care who you are. Uh, you have bias. You may not know it, but it will come out in some way, shape, or form at some point in time. And I think in being able to commit to that ongoing self-reflection and just education around biases and what they mean and how they can show up. But then also, seeking feedback from others, if because sometimes I know we
Hmm.
don't see it, but other people could see it, right? And I think sometimes just asking for that kind of feedback from others and challenging stereotypes that are out there as well is very open and just being open to growth. I mean, we all at ICAN, we believe we have lifelong learners. You never stop learning. You never stop learning. And so I think with the bias question is just being able to recognize it and being willing to deal with it.
Yeah, self-awareness is so important as leaders, and we're never done. We never get to say, "Okay, I'm totally self-aware now."
Hmm.
It's got to be an ongoing process. As Aileen said, I'm a huge fan of 360-degree feedback, for example, and getting feedback from others.
Hmm.
And I read something a while back about look at your close circle of influencers, the people that you go to get advice, maybe close personal friends or your peers in the workplace or whatever, maybe family members, but always challenge yourself to let that network become more diverse. And especially getting input from people different than you, that think differently, that are in different age groups. And as I teach in the universities, I get more energized by 20 something thinkers oftentimes than I do people my own age. And because they challenge your biases, if you will, or they challenge your kind of set in ways of thinking. And that's just healthy, I think.
Yeah, the whole inclusion part is so important. I know there are some of my friends that kind of have their own personal board of directors, and
Yeah.
there are people from all walks of life, that can help them in terms of their journey, their leadership journey, or just their journey in
Yep.
general. And it makes a huge difference. It really makes a huge difference. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and I believe this is free, it's Harvard's implicit bias test.
Hmm.
It's online, and I'm pretty sure that it's free,
I think so.
that you can go out and you can actually take that on your own. And that would probably also give you some insight if you had some concerns around, any biases that you may be carrying around.
Great.
That's
Great.
perfect.
Great advice. All right, another great question. What should I do if I witness discrimination or bias? What steps should I take?
Well, the HR professional in me would say that many times people would come to HR and they would share that information with us, and we were obligated to look into that for sure to find out what transpired. And again, it kind of depends on the individual, right? It depends on the
Mhm.
severity, I guess. That's the other thing that I would say, because sometimes people just say inappropriate things.
Yeah.
Sometimes people, so it really depends. For me, it always depended on how deep the situation was in terms of what transpired. But HR is always a good sounding board, even you as an individual, if you have a situation and you're not sure how to handle that, you can definitely go to your HR department and get some support and some guidance in terms of what you could do and how you can react. And sometimes HR would have to get involved, but sometimes not.
That's great advice, Eileen. I think, okay, so the activist in me would go back to the John Lewis's famous quote, if you see something, do something. And oftentimes we're reluctant. We're reluctant
Mhm.
to say anything or step forward because we have our own fears. And, we got our own career to manage. And, what if this
Mhm.
backfires and all of that? I think just check your heart. If your heart's in the right place and you see something, first step would maybe be to reach out to that person before you say anything more, and say, "Hey, I may be wrong here, but I noticed this, and is there anything I can do to help? Or should I step forward and say something to the other person?" And oftentimes people just go, "Oh, no, 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 but thank you for asking." And
Mhm.
so, but I also believe when John Lewis says, when you see something, do something, it's rare that doing nothing is the right answer.
I would agree with that.
Right,
Definitely.
right.
Yeah. And like I said, it really depends on the situation and it really depends on
Yeah.
what's happening in terms of the course of action that you would take. But I agree, John, doing something is paramount.
Right. Thank you. How do I ensure allyship is a safe space?
I think it's all the things we've been talking about in
Yeah.
terms of safety. If checking our own heart, make sure that our intentions are honorable, are honest, that we're being transparent, and just be on the watch for hurtful activities or language. Um,
Hmm.
what do you think,
And
Allie?
as leaders, yeah, and I was gonna say sometimes as leaders you can help set the tone, right? In
Yeah,
terms of your
yeah,
culture and your environment at work, or in a club that you're in, whatever the case may be, that sometimes we have to step up and we can kind of set the tone um to ensure that there's no repercussions, there's no,
yeah,
negative actions that will occur, if a person decides to speak up and speak out. And sometimes it's rallying around that individual. I've been in situations where, someone will say something and people think, well, that person shouldn't have said it. And maybe I speak up and say, well, yeah, they should have said it. It needed to be
yeah.
said, kind of
Right,
thing. So sometimes just providing that support to individuals can be really important as well.
right. Okay, thank you. I have another question coming in. Can you request that a company establish a male allyship program in this environment? Great question.
Yeah.
You can. You could definitely do that. I think in this current environment, me personally, I think it's just at this point, I would just say more inquire about an overall allyship program
Yeah.
because men and women are going to be included in that. And so if you create an allyship program of some type, I think it's going out and making sure that everybody, based on what's happening and based on our discussion today, that it's very inclusive, that everybody is a part of that. And you talk about the expectations of being an ally, right? If people raise their hand and they want to be a part of the program, what is that going to entail? And what are your expectations for those individuals that would participate? That's what I would
Yeah, I
do.
love
Yeah.
that. I love that. And I think it goes back maybe, Aline, to our discussion about ERPs. If you're in an ERG or a resource group of some kind with a focus, bringing more resources to that group. So again, the example was it's a women's leadership resource group, bringing in some men to have that discussion, bringing in younger women, more experienced women, younger men, more experienced men, people of different backgrounds, just really always looking for diversity of helpers, if you will, and keeping that to be a rich resource.
Right. Well, Allyne and John, thank you so much for the discussion and answering questions. We are running out of time. So, Allyne, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Well, that's all the time we have today. But if you have any more questions, please feel free to contact either John or myself. Our emails are on the reflection guide that Amy sent to you all ahead of time, as well as on the slide as we conclude the session today. I want to encourage you to take advantage of any resources your own company may have. Visit your HR department, join an ERG, or suggest your company develop an allyship program of some sort. Thank you again for joining us today.